Hey everybody, welcome back to our weekly podcast. My name is Patrick Tan, General Counsel for ChainArgos. We are the blockchain intelligence firm that was made famous for uncovering Binance's BUSD under collateralization. And with me, as usual, every week, Jonathan Reiter, our CEO and Chief Data Scientist. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for all the likes, comments, and subscriptions. I know one of you requested the paper that John is working on about the impossibility, the governance. Yeah, somebody left a comment about wanting that paper. That paper is in an academic preprint, so it will be available.
No, there's a copy up on the SSRN already.
There you go.
Just fine.
So just we'll leave the link into the comment section shortly. And this week, what we're going to talk about, we're going to jump straight into the ADGM stablecoin rules. ADGM standing for Abu Dhabi Global Market. Spoiler alert, it is not the oasis in the desert that some stablecoin proponents may have hoped for. What was that? Restrictions apply. Restrictions apply. All right. AAVE Governance, some interesting stuff that's been happening over there. John will give us the full information. And finally, we're going to talk about NFTs and the SEC's Wells notice against OpenSea. And, to be fair, it's just a Wells notice, which just means that I guess it's when the mob sends a bullet in an envelope to your house.
I don't think that happens in the real world.
But yeah, something like that, where they're just kind of like, giving you a heads up, use Nix, bro, kind of thing. But not so. Wells notice, for those of you who may not be familiar, is just an intention, putting them on alert that there's an intention to take some kind of regulatory action against them, and then you can sort of try to speculate as to what that it's going to be, because it's up to them to disclose any information from the Wells notice itself. So let's just go straight to ADGM first. ADGM Abu Dhabi Global Market. This is a special. Think of it like an oasis in the desert, if you like.
Sort of. It's a free trade area.
It's a free trade area, like a special economic zone, something similar to what China had in the early days of its economic liberalization, where you had places like Shenzhen and sort of having more commercial.
The UAE local market's not as restricted.
It is not
China
that is correct,
ago,
but conceptually it's the same. So they start off on a blank piece of paper. The idea is that you don't have any of these legacy laws and financial regulations and stuff like that. You start off a blank piece of paper, but
and you can't deal locally.
And you can't deal locally. So one of the interesting things that we looked at was the ADGM stablecoin rules, because we've seen quite a bit of press saying that, this is great, the UAE is extremely forward-looking, and it'll be like a free-for-all. No.
Well, so it's interesting. So they're trying to solve a slightly different problem, or they're addressing a problem that other regulators have not really looked at yet. So the issue here is that there is a local currency in the UAE, the dirham, which is pegged, it's a currency board, against the US dollar, but the currency in and of itself isn't used very widely. The local market is not very large. There's not much trade in goods and services there domestically. Right? They obviously export a lot of oil and stuff like, other petrochemical things, and some other services and whatnot. So nobody's going to be building huge stable coins that use the UAE currency, because that's just not a major internationally traded currency. It's going to be US dollars and maybe euros, yen, whatever. So they're not going to be providing banks with, the banks aren't going to have huge interest-bearing deposits locally for these types of, for stablecoin issuers, that type of thing. So guys are immediately going to have to put their money into some kinds of interest-bearing treasury bills, things like that in order to earn interest. The banks could develop a whole program to do that. Historically, they've not been interested. It's not a highly levered local financial system. That's not what they're doing over there. So the question is, how can you provide a regulatory regime that allows safe and desirable, useful to hold stablecoins? And as they themselves note, because the terms between the money going in and the money going out, the time window there is often long enough that interest could be meaningful. It would be nice if there was a way to pay interest to the holders to make the product more useful. People are, as we have mentioned many times, and everyone knows, unlikely to want to hold a huge amount of non-interest-bearing dollar-like instruments if the base rate in dollars is 5%, 4%. Frankly, even if it's 1 or 2%, people are only indifferent when the number is effectively zero. And this is a slightly different question because they're not concerned about, in the U.S. and other parts of the world, there's concerns about paying people interest out of a product being a securities law problem. I'm not worried about that at all. They're worried about finding a reliable way to do this. At a high level, the issuer takes a bunch of money in for selling stablecoins, sticks them into some interest-bearing vehicle, and then pays interest in some way to the holders. But as a regulator, you need to tighten that up a little bit, right? So there's a maturity limit on the length of the instruments that you can purchase. You can't buy 30-year bonds. You can only buy 30-day, 60-day, at weighted average maturity, whatever. Procedures for what the custodians are, the time windows that you're required to redeem in, all of that kind of stuff. Capitalization requirements, because even if you only own 1 month notes, the price can still go up and down, and they want 100% reliability. So their paper is primarily, the rule discussion that they've put out is primarily about those questions. How do you set up an extremely reliable, not onerous capital requirement operation? How does it work legally? You don't need a banking license, but what we're doing here is a little bit outside the scope of a normal payment services provider. So is that the right regime? Do you want to do this a little bit differently? And they have a fascinating Q&A, basically, for, 10, 15 pages about all these issues. And, it definitely makes sense that you don't have the simplicity of just a payment provider if you're going to try to pay interest to people, but you don't need a full banking license. Bank capitalization requirements don't feel reasonable. All of that sort of stuff is, those are very, very reasonable questions, right? Now, they don't directly address any KYC, AML type concerns here. They punt entirely to other documents that exist for the ADGM requirements and note that they have to follow those requirements. And what's interesting here is that it makes clear that whatever regime they come up with, will it use the money transmitter rules? Will it use something closer to banking, fund manager type rules? Whatever. They're still going to have to follow all of the standard money laundering business rules and the rest of it. So I'll read here from the AML rules for the purposes of 8121, so the section that customer due diligence. In determining when it is appropriate to apply customer due diligence measures in relation to existing customers, a relevant person must take into account, amongst other things, A, any indication that the identity of the customer or the customer's beneficial owners has changed, B, any transactions that are not reasonably consistent with the relevant person's knowledge of the customer, C, any change in the purpose or intended nature of the relevant person's relationship with the customer, or D, any other matter that might affect the relevant person's risk assessment of the customer. That doesn't say if you suspect for any reason the UBO changed, you need to redo the due diligence stuff. But it also doesn't say that you can simply ignore the beneficiary changing, right? And since they're talking directly about providing interest to the holders of the tokens, it seems like the intention is for those to count as customers of the issuer of the stable coins, whatever regime is set up for that. Those rules haven't been promulgated yet. And they make it extremely clear that they don't plan on having separate rules. Right? So this is interesting. Right? In the U.S., the regime has historically been people decided to start calling things payment stablecoins and getting money transmitter licenses and saying that they only had to KYC the people who put money in and took money out.
Yeah. And
the government has made no comments ever about whether that interpretation of the rules is reasonable or not. Because they haven't here, because these places have much more overt and recently written rules about what customer due diligence is and when you have to perform it. I guess it's primarily A, maybe B, maybe C. D is a catch-all, right? Whether those require, like the Swiss rules explicitly stated, constant redoing of due diligence, which is of course going to turn into whitelisting, remains to be seen. They make clear that they're not addressing that at this time, and they're going to come up with this interest structure set of rules first. In a number of places, they reference regimes in other parts of the world and trying to make it at least as or more competitive than those regimes. And if those regimes start coming down on one side of the KYC requirement, Switzerland has made their position clear already. It'll be interesting to see how that evolves. I don't think that they're going to be an outlier in the do whatever you want and don't KYC department, because that's generally not the way things work. But
it's if you look at the specific language that this is drafted in, it is sufficiently wide to say, let's just look at A. Any indication that identity of the customer or the customer's beneficial owners has changed. that's basically a transfer. As long as the transfer happens, that's an indication that the identity, whether or not it's changed, but something that you have to look into.
And because it's exactly the same rules, so literally the same document, they
Yeah,
point to the same
yeah.
document as regular banking and whatnot, allowing stablecoin transfers to proceed in a regulated environment without any additional KYC legalizes bearer bonds, bearer accounts, and all the rest of that, because it's literally the same rules. It's the same exact line. And that is not the intention, for sure. So we'll see. But because the structure of ADGM is all quite new, all the documents are, the entire infrastructure is from scratch, you don't have as much of a confused web of this goes back to this, the act from 1923 goes forward to that, can be harder to figure out. This really is very straightforward to go through.
Well, I mean, that's what happens when you get a fresh oasis in the desert, I guess.
So it's,
you build the first well and find out. So switching gears, let's talk about AAVE governance, because this is a cool one. You have all the, what's the 411?
So AAVE is another borrowing, lending, interest earning platform. What's interesting about AAVE is that, so the usual procedure, there's some kind of a staking process. Now, AAVE, when you have a borrowing and lending market, network, protocol, product, there's the possibility that someone doesn't pay loans back and a loss occurs, and that loss has to get eaten by someone. So the way that works in traditional finance is I lend you money, I buy a bond issued by you, and you default, and it recovers 80% after the liquidation procedure, and I get back 80% of my money. Job done.
Mission accomplished.
The way that a lot of these things worked historically, I mean DeFi protocols in general, there's some kind of insurance fund, and eventually somebody acknowledges the loss, takes some money out of the insurance fund, and moves on. You hear talk about bad debt and the DAO voting to recognize bad debt or something functionally the same as that. What that means is there's a negative equity sitting somewhere that nobody's dealt with yet, and the whole system's insolvent, and they're just hoping that the withdrawals don't tip it over into insolvency. In the case of AAVE, there is a facility where you can stake certain tokens into a loss backstopping procedure, and the idea is that when they need to get money out of that procedure, they call it slash your deposits and then sell the tokens. I think what they mean is seize the tokens you've deposited. So they slash your deposit and transfer it to themselves. They don't burn the tokens. Sell them to raise money. The issue is that the tokens that you can stake are not really traded. They're not particularly liquid. Mm-hmm. And openly they've stated they're concerned that if there's a meaningful loss, losses have historically been mild.
Yeah.
If there's a meaningful loss, they'll go to sell the tokens and the whole system will collapse. Remember that what happened, the limit version of that is Luna, where they kept selling the tokens and eventually no one wanted to buy any tokens. So what they're deciding now is to change the way this works a little bit. Right? So instead of taking your tokens and then selling them, they're going to create the tokens that you receive when you deposit, A tokens. We're not going to go into the whole AAVE process here, but you deposit assets and you receive a receipt for those assets. Right? They're going to make something like the receipts for those assets slashable. So what that does is it just assigns the losses to whoever's currently holding the receipt for the deposit in the first place. This is a reasonable thing to do because you're removing this, in case of fire, break glass, but there's nothing inside the glass mechanism.
Well, you can still break the glass anyway.
Yeah, but before there was an awareness the backstop might turn out to be air.
Yeah.
Here they're just saying whoever's holding the receipts is just going to get pro rata slashed.
Yeah.
Which is great. Right?
Yeah.
If 10% of the value defaults, is realized as a loss, well then 10% of the outstanding liabilities just get a haircut.
Yeah.
That's acknowledging reality. So it's nice to see that.
Yeah.
The concern here, I would say, is not financial. This is a much simpler scheme. This looks exactly the way corporate credit works everywhere in the world, approximately. There's some more mechanical details about how AAVE works. Don't really matter for these conversations. It becomes, I think, more of a legal problem in that the more this really just looks like a borrowing and lending relationship with a contract, the more it looks like not having any legal structure around that is going to be a problem for you. All right. If you want to do corporate bonds without any paperwork, you're probably going to have a problem in the end. But financially, it makes a lot of sense. Right? So it's interesting to watch, where the solution is quite clear. And yet, fair enough, it is the regulatory clarity here. Like, I don't know what will happen if people decide to just run a straight-up borrowing and lending market. There's a default, there's a loss, slash the liability holders, next. Okay. I mean, they were moving this. They came up with a scheme. They thought they could have additional tokens to use as a backstop so that nobody'd have to bear the loss on the main token. And what happened is they realized, well, if it's not the main token, it has no value. No one wants to use it, so you can't auction it for any value. And then your choices are either slash the main token, bring the main token back in and risk the whole protocol on this, or just assign losses to the lenders. Assign losses to the lenders is fine, but you then remind the lenders their money's at risk.
Yeah.
Which
they don't want to.
I mean, if they thought there was no risk, then that's
correct.
concerning. Right? It's a
like it's the mental models that they had, but there isn't a good answer to this.
I mean, the losses have to get assigned somewhere.
Yeah, somebody's got to carry the can.
Michael Pettis, who's an economist who covers China and other stuff, talks about this a lot in economies where there's a problem. A lot of the arguments are about allocation of losses.
Yeah.
The losses exist already. There's a loss of X that needs to be assigned. All right, so this is a process of making the loss assignment clearer. A lot of political systems historically work because they obfuscate loss assignment and make people think that the loss is not being assigned to them when it is. That's a lesson about history for thousands of years. That usually works politically, right? That gets you reelected and whatever. But it may be a problem if the loss assignment procedure is published publicly as code. People can figure out where it goes, and no one wishes to buy the tokens that might get the loss assigned to them, which is exactly what you're seeing here, which is just kind of amusing in that, democracy is transparent in some ways and not in others. And some of those lessons are popping up here again.
Finally, let's talk about OpenSea and NFTs and the SEC's Wells notice.
So OpenSea is I believe, legally New York-based.
Yes, I believe so. Yes.
Marketplace for NFTs, and they will tell you that it's a digital art.
Yeah.
They're a trading platform for art, like any other trading platform for art, and in some sense, that's true. I mean, there are pictures attached to a lot of these things. They've been sent a Wells notice, so this is the SEC telling them that they intend to pursue some kind of enforcement action. This is a thing that exists in the U.S. where they have to tell companies before they do that. In part, that exists because many of the companies the SEC takes action against are public companies, and they need to effect a disclosure, and the U.S. government doesn't do things like publicly announce that they're going to take enforcement action against XYZ company. They issue a bunch of rules around public companies' disclosure requirements, and then tell the company, by the way, we're going to do X, fulfill your disclosure requirements.
Yeah.
Right? So for non-listed companies, it devolves into a little more of a, do you want to tell anybody or not? Whatever. Satisfy your investors, make the SEC happy as far as that's concerned. The disclosure rules. So, I mean, presumably it's something to do with securities because that's what the S stands for, and NFTs because that's what OpenSea does. And what's interesting here is that the SEC has reached settlements with a couple of NFT projects relatively recently. So there is, in a legal sense, a clear precedent that some of this stuff is securities. And we're not opining that we believe they're securities. We're saying someone's paid a fine on the basis that they were securities.
Yeah.
So the government feeling pretty good about that. Right? So that is proceeding. The extent to which OpenSea is trading in those types of things, there may also be other enforcement actions that we don't know about yet. Because again, they can issue a Wells notice to a random NFT project, and we'd never, you wouldn't find out till the settlement is announced. So they may have a longer list of this or not. We don't talk about NFTs much here. Nobody thinks we're NFT aficionados or experts. They may have a laundry list of products that have been traded on OpenSea that would qualify as securities. As soon as they have a ruling that something's a security and it's traded on OpenSea, the case is made.
Yeah.
Right. You can argue to a judge on the merits these things aren't securities and relitigate all of that. But if the government can present a stack of settlements with the issuers of the exact tokens that were traded on your platform in which they paid a fine on the basis that they were securities, you need to make a really serious, convincing argument to overcome that with anybody. I would imagine a judge, maybe, it's hard to see how a jury isn't simply going to say these people paid millions of dollars on the basis they were securities. You're claiming they're not and they were all wrong, but you're going to get fined here and they've already paid. Guilty as charged, Your Honor. Right? It doesn't feel like that's a trial that you'd want to take to a jury under any circumstances. People normally take payments for settling the accusation you did something wrong as a moral admission of guilt, even if
if there is no.
That's a tough one. So I'm not sure how that'll come down. I will note that in the case of at least the Stoner Cats project that settled with the SEC in somewhat contentious circumstances, people think this was ridiculous. They set up what's called a fair fund. So this is the way the government administers payments back to aggrieved, damaged, harmed, whatever investors, and they filed. This is months ago now, asking for more time to set up the fund because they don't, they need to appoint an administrator and deal with the distribution procedures and the rest of it. And that settlement was in the end of last year, and the distribution plan hasn't even been published yet for that fair fund. There are a lot of questions here because the government's, I think, not used to, in the case of U.S. listed equity where there's a problem or some security where they can track down all the holders, they know who's in what country or whatever and just make the payments. You see this with FTX where there's unknown international whatever investors. Madoff had unknown international investors. Some of these NFTs, particularly if it's a fractional NFT schemes or a series with 10,000 NFTs or 100 NFTs, which are held by which people that the U.S. can and can't deal with directly, who's KYCing for what, how are they going to make these determinations. That's challenging, right? That's definitely challenging. And they don't really have precedent for that kind of a widespread all over the world for small amounts of money. I mean, Madoff was all over the world. It was tens of billions of dollars. Here you've got, thousands of things that are worth hundreds to thousands of dollars each. The settlement, these were on the order of $1 million settlements. How are they going to go hunt down hundreds of aggrieved investors or harmed investors and accredit who they are because they're not paying money to they're not sending Tether to a random Ethereum address, a Tron address. That's not how this will work. So none of that's been done before for these types of, because each NFT is to some extent unique, right? So you're going to have a guy saying, here's my one NFT, give me my $800. That's nothing like the normal procedures where you collect all the claims. The claims are all equivalent. Oh, my NFT has a green background, so it's worth 4 times as much. That doesn't exist with stocks. I mean, it doesn't. They are different in that sense. Yes, I don't know how that's going to work. That's fascinating. But it does feel like they probably have a pretty strong case only because they can go to a jury and say these people already paid us money on the basis of securities. The rest of it is going to be fascinating to watch.
Yep.
With no opinion on whether this digital art thing in it. Most of this regulation stuff is properly viewed as a game, right? And once they've got these guys, they can move on to the next step. And your way to push back is to prevent. You don't want to be listing tokens where they are celebrity endorsers because celebrity endorsers make the government more likely to go after them and pressure them. And a celebrity is more likely to say,
I'll pay.
Here's $200,000 so I don't have any trouble. I'll never touch in that industry again, moving on. Yeah. And then they have a piece of paper that says that. Security. We talked about this.
We've seen that and we've talked about it. We've seen that time and time again because they don't. That's it was fun for all the shits and giggles, but we're done.
As an anonymous project founder, you probably do want celebrity promoters. As a exchange operator, you probably don't want to list celebrity promoted tokens because, again, as we've said many times, if there's only 1% chance you get caught and you do it 1,000,000 times, there's a 100% chance you get caught. Right. So.
And on that note, thank you for tuning in. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening wherever you get your podcast. Stay tuned next week where we'll be back with more of the stuff. Otherwise, have a great weekend.